could you go, because I think you were really trying to dive into the philosophical subtext behind your work, or in a certain way. And in order to give us access to it, I think that if you could clarify that passage in particular and your understanding of how the gathering, the affirmative gathering of community, also is dependent upon a negative space. Is that what you're saying? A negative space of community, which is unconditional. Because earlier you mentioned something that I also found paradoxical. You mentioned that that you felt that some of the efforts or activities you were describing we could call concrete building activities. They were trying to foster community through direct social interaction. And you're proposing to approach community in a different way through some kind of a priori or pre-existing, pre-voluntary.
It's even free from your will.
Pre-willed, like foundational conditions. Okay, and can you elaborate how what is that foundational condition? And how does that relate to community in the abstract?
The pre-voluntary base of the community is that the very impossibility of community, the very impossibility of gathering.
And do you mean that in a philosophical sense or in a historical sense, that today, because of the atomization of larger social unities?
In fact, Nancy exactly used the war and the atomic weapon as a tool to prove the impossibility of gathering.
This is where the nuts and bolts person in me gets a little bit lost. How does that relate to, say, the gathering we have in front of us? This gathering is
that's the gathering of community who is based on the communion or the common interest. But that's the one form. But I think like we are still coming from still based on the core idea of community, which is just the negativity of what we are doing here.
Would you allow me to try to link back the idea of the absent community to your exhibition more as a question? What I found striking in the space on street level is that there are like many sensations evolved, like a certain scent of lonely, of burnt wood, and also warmth and a breeze, so like sensual experiences. And usually these experiences are releasing very individual memories, daydreams, whatever. But the perception is a very common thing. So you perceive it together with strangers around you. But this perception doesn't unify a community, but on the contrary. So maybe this is talking a bit about the absent. Everybody is thrown into him or herself a very individual sentiments, feelings.
I totally agree with what Nina just said. In fact, I would. No, stay where I am for just now. Jeremiah's going to do my study.
No, does anybody want to call herbal tea?
Well, I would put us. My way of experiencing the phenomenon that Nina just described is that piece on the ground floor, in a way, conjures a viewer. You know, I think all artworks do that. They conjure up an ideal viewer. They say, you know, this is talking to you, a certain kind of you. And in a way, I felt that your piece was conjuring an impossible viewer. That you were saying, in effect, with your piece, I'm speaking to this kind of person and to that kind of, and to that kind of, and they didn't add up. Do you see what I mean? So there was a sort of radiator. I don't know what you call these things. That's right. An overhead heater, and then there was a fan. So first I'm too warm, and then I'm too cold, and then there was a certain kind of scent, and then a totally different kind of scent. And Nina, tell me if I'm totally twisting the meaning of your comment, but my understanding was that you were interpolating different kinds of viewers. So you're asking the viewer to wear a whole host of different masks that were mutually exclusionary or incompatible. So I suppose I have two questions. First, am I misreading the work? And secondly, if I'm not misreading the work, does that impression tally with your account of the community of absence, or with what you were saying earlier about sort of foundational notion of community?
Yeah, actually this is what I wanted to avoid of talking about my show much in this framework, but we are there already, much quicker than I expected. Yes, your interpretation as well as Nina's comment is quite right, especially the using of sense, which was never implanted in my previous work, was very effort to generate this universe, not the general, the universal commonness, which never is the same, and that again responds to the idea of the singular being. And you kind of course, there was me as an author who made the arrangement, and but then again it's completely out of my hands somehow, what kind of association, emotions, and commemorium could arise from that. That's completely kind of free, and that openness probably you described as a randomness and authenticity of the artist who is traveling. I think without the traveling, I kind of evoke that randomness as the authenticity, not authenticity of mine, but authenticity, the open to the authenticity of the others.
Do you want to pull it back away from a little bit from a reflection on your work? Because I also think that a lot of the material you presented is interesting to talk about. And so I have one question which relates more to Haegue, to your personal experience and also to mine, which is that my experience of the nomadic artist is not one of some kind of an ontological position or an interesting strategy, but really one of loss, which is the impossibility of the artist to have a home, the impossibility of the artist to have an experience of a specific public realm, and in order for artists, mostly for artists who have unconventional strategies and can't access a local market for their work, they end up in a kind of an international, which isn't really international, it's mostly Western European residency structure of funding. And so I wonder if the pretense of nomadism would be better to be described as refugee, because we have lost something. And if that is the case, if nomadism is a kind of a refugee status, then I wonder how does that then reflect upon someone like Rickrit, or Rickrit's travels as a kind of as someone who also his own biography is kind of homeless, or his ability to experience home. And I wonder how that is a kind of inversion, but I wonder how that could relate to the issue of nomadism as you raised it.
They descended from the blacksmiths. Traditionally gypsies were blacksmiths, or many gypsies in medieval Europe applied their trade as blacksmiths. They had forged the nails that were used in the crucifixion, and their punishment was to move around eternally. Nomadism in the 19th century was always framed in terms of punishment. and in terms of exclusion. But today, of course, if we look at the elites, the technocratic elites of our world, they are nomadic. And this is, Zygmunt Bauman, the great, the sociologist, he's always talking about the nomadic lifestyles of, the most powerful in today's world. And one of the odd things is that the terms that are often used to describe Tiruvangia, to describe his work and his lifestyle, and the intersection of the two, are very similar to the terms that Zygmunt Bauman uses to describe today's nomadic elites.
And you're not going from a place, not expect from a place, but you're going to the place where you're needed.
Yeah.
And it's like the home circle manages activities.
Exactly.
I'm also wondering if you aware of the possible distinctions between the travelers and the business travelers. I don't know, because there were confusing moments in your talk that I didn't know which kind of travel you were referring to, because in my case, I agreed very much with Jeremiah that I'm not traveling because I'm a passionate traveler. Not at all. It's nothing but either a business trip that I have to go somewhere to set up something, or as you said, cultural refugees that I'm so dependent on the funding that I apply for the residency and spend time there. But then again, for me, the confusing part of this, being not a romantic traveler, is that still I experienced what romantic travelers would experience, partly, not completely, but partly. And that's confusing to myself, to be honest, because I'm not I'm taking a trip like the businessmen. I think the businessmen are the most traveled people, as well as some politicians, international politicians. Not the traveler itself. I don't think that's really a lot of traveling people. But the creative producers, musicians and artists, they do make business travels, but they kind of have partly the experience of romantic travel. And what is it? And how can we deal with it? And does it, so it means that we resemble somehow the refugees who is forced to go, but then again we share the fantasy or the illusionary experience of the travelers as well.
So I don't understand why the comparison to a refugee who is forced to go, or a businessman. A businessman can be a non-traveling businessman. He could just keep it to his local space, or he could make it more international. You seem to assume that it's already necessary to be international. I don't see
why the businessmen cannot reduce their travel.
Yeah.
I don't know, but
I'm speaking in metaphor. Why do you consider yourself? You don't have to be a refugee. It almost sounds like there's almost an assumption that in order to be an artist, you have to travel abroad.
But that's the fact. Many people are saying that I'm going for the profession of art because it provides me a lot of mobility, and that's interesting in our time.
But that's the other way around. Then it's a choice. When you say it's a refugee, you're forced to go abroad not because you want to, but because you're going away from something that's at the space where you're coming from. That's a different concept.
No, they're talking about funding, surviving.
The funding as well as the exhibition businesses. But the exhibition businesses also requires you travel.
That's what.
One at a time. So you were suggesting that the metaphor was inaccurate because the artist chooses.
No, I'm asking why it's a necessary.
Okay.
It seems it's an assumption. So apparently there's something necessary in being a professional artist. You are traveling around where the money is, or where the commissions are, whatever. Is that true? Is that what the
I have a
time we
similar
are living?
question. Like when you explain something, Haegue, you have some kind of urgency. Like I still have a romantic traveler's way of seeing this, although I'm not. How do we deal with it? You ask such questions, and I wonder, deal with what? Like, why is that a problem? Or like there's some kind of when you're putting all these backgrounds, or when you say we often say we about the community. I am wondering who you're talking about. Like where are you? Are you one of these we? But who are the others with you? Or like all these, I'm just curious, like how to enter into your space, because it's a similar question.
No,
because
it's
you
not.
are
I think it's very different.
there. You somehow describe what you see, and then you make that into an urgent situation. Like we are leading this lifestyle. How am I going to deal with this? You know, instead of this is the way it is. Things become problems. Do you understand? Do you understand this? Okay. When you're posing questions, or the way that you see, whether you describe all these philosophers from certain countries, actually, or like either the Germany or France, or the way that I'm curious about how you have an exhibition and then you want to have this discussion, sort of separate in a separate space, and how you wanted to sort of not discuss the exhibition, but more talk more about this, whatever you're talking about, this about the community. Do you see what I'm saying? Maybe I'm making more confusion.
Yeah, I think.
I think the exhibition and the subject we wanted to broad is definitely related to but what Haegue wanted to avoid. Like she explained and defend her exhibition in her own words, and actually now we are in kind of confusing stage. But I don't know. I just like to reveal how I understand this community of absence. It can be really easy because, like, there are like 10 people around here, just suppose, and then 9 people belong to a certain club or a certain community, and then you immediately excluded from this world of 10 people. But when you recognize problem or conflict or limit of the community of 9 people, you certainly find a possibility of another community or another way of attachment or belonging. So by this way of finding everyone's limit, everyone's impossibility of belonging or pure belonging to a community, we can dream of broader community. That's what I understood. And that concept of community of absence is in a way quite related to what Nina brought. Like Nina contrasted this community-based art, which was flourished in 90s, which really kind of serve to one aim, in the way of directing other people under certain authority. And then by this practice of temporary community or experimental community, you emphasize this incompleteness or impermanence of certain community. So yeah, that's just a bit of my understanding, which I hope contribute to your understanding.
But I still actually don't think, I think both jumped off of, so now we have 3 tangential lines of discussion. But I think in order to keep one thread, I think we should go back to the first one because it was at least relatively clear choices. Is the international artistic community, is the use of refugee an accurate or even vaguely accurate provocation?
Jeremiah told already why certain people kind of forced to rely on this very empty idea of international community, because simply like artists like me fail to belong to the local scene. It's very clear somehow. I mean, there is solid scene in every locality that is somehow quite solid and tight. That I think there is no way that I can attach myself to the scene. And even though this international scene is kind of empty, this kind of negativity of what has left that I kind of going, like that's also maybe, it's not an option, I think, it's destined to be so.
It also shows in the frequent use of the term home base, and you read more and more artists, X not lives in their base, which means, okay, this is my home base, and it's like kind of a fluctuant community, and but everybody is traveling. I mean, maybe Berlin is an interesting example for that at the moment, because many people are going through, many people are moving in, moving out, and are traveling because nobody finds actually work in Berlin, and bankrupt city. But it's interesting for several other reasons. So people are based there, and they're based there, but they have their commitments in other places.
But it does.
I think the notion of refugee is a little bit too strong for all our situation.
Yeah.
Because
But too strong term.
I think it is, because it is a choice, and I mean, as an international artist, we do choose for the situation of being displaced for one reason or the other, because you think it's more interesting, or you think you build up something different, but you could have chosen something
How
else.
about the term, like, as another suggestion, how about the term of immigrated artist?
That's great, I choose it too, but there is something that we all choose. So, I mean, you can always choose something else, and it's not...
Part of the reason that I raised it was also related to one of the projects you proposed. Was you proposed a group of artists in India in a context with 40% illiteracy in their context, and you said that they had become more publicly known after being undocumented. So that's an example where, like, if internationally known, they had become. But the question that for them, they have a two-track public. They have a public that is international and a public that is local. The international public is going to be per se much more sympathetic to those efforts than their ability to battle overwhelming probably social inequality in their locality. So even if they stay in their locality, there will be much more sympathy for them internationally. And that's the kind of direction I was going for. And of course it is way overstated to suggest that we are so, that we could compare ourselves to people who have lost their home due to a war, of course. But that's sort of what I meant. But I wonder, also listening to you talk, there was another issue that comes up, and this also relates to Rickrit and perhaps to you as well, Haegue, which is that previously artworks traveled. Artworks would travel from exhibition to exhibition, and sometimes the artists would go for an opening. But now, inasmuch as the question of what the art is there an artwork, or is the artist the artwork, and this, it's hard to say it's like a chicken or egg, but they definitely seem to, chicken or egg, but they do seem to go hand in hand.
And that actually affects our understanding of the work you just mentioned, the work that Nina discussed by Sarai. Because surely, in that case, the work traveled. The artist didn't travel. The work traveled, in effect, to Documenta, where it was shown in a different context. Right? And Nina, you spoke earlier about the risk of a centralizing community, of artists, called in to act as ambassadorial figures for a certain community that then gets treated in very, very reductive terms. And I was wondering about that in the context of Sarai. It sounded like a really, really interesting project. But there are surely two ways of seeing it and two ways of talking about it. On the one hand, you can think of it as something which people participated in, many people living possibly in the same country but in different parts of the country. And so it served a certain function for its user participants. And then it becomes something utterly different when it's presented as a self-contained artwork in a context like documentary, where presumably it for many viewers, many viewers will have a sort of essentializing reaction to it. They think, oh, this is what's going on in India, this is an expression of communities as they've emerged through the internet in India. Is that fair or not?
To avoid a misunderstanding, it was not the Cyber Mohala project that was documented.
Oh.
So it's Sarai is this group of 30 artists, theoreticians, and one sub-project of them is the Cyber Mohala.
Okay.
But the Cyber Mohala wasn't exhibited. But I would like to draw a distinction between the project I was talking about in the beginning, maybe, for example, the Haegue group who did this gardening project with HIV positive people, and then the Cyber Mohala project by Sarai in India. And whereas Sarai, the Cyber Mohala project, is going to a certain Mohala, to a certain part of the city, setting up a meeting point for kids where they can use computers and whatever they would like to use, so following their needs. And Haegue was, on the contrary, doing a gardening project with HIV positive people, and this is stigmatizing. So why should I be interested in gardening just because I'm HIV positive? So it's just about gathering this group of HIV positive people, like marginalized people, and marginalize them even more because they are these people who have to participate in this gardening project.
But wouldn't it be stigmatizing to have your community project then represented in another country? Doesn't the essentialization similarly occur, but the essentialization occurs at the level of the video record or the video documentation? So it becomes a kind of weird welfare ethnography, I wonder.
Depends. I don't think you can generalize it.
Well, it's interesting. In Holland, there at the Rijksacademie, which is an institution here, maintains localized programs in other countries from some of the participants who have traveled to Holland. So there's some projects in Africa and Asia, and there certainly was a debate of whether or not this was actually a form of assuaging certain Dutch guilt about not just colonialism, but also their own ongoing participation in multinational capitalism. And so that this was a part of the welfare state, that the welfare state had reached out through cultural funding to then bring kind of happy stories back about what the Dutch people had done abroad back to Holland. And in that sense, it then really does become a flip side to the jet set international business people. But of course, it does depend upon whether or not those videos undocumented do essentialize India or not, or how complicated they are in terms of are they actually artworks or not.
Yeah, and also I think the quality of the community and the way they are participating in the production of an artwork, I think this is really what makes a distinction. So is the quality of a community, is it an essentialist one? Like homeless people, HIV positive, whatever, or is it
forming the dispersion and the differences of people? That really like the criteria for the judging the quality of the community, something like that. But not maybe exactly the sense of the multitudes suggested by the Negri and the heart. Like that's what I thought that it's interesting to coming from this very core idea of community and then reflect the practice you mentioned, because then again, then it's not about the exclusion and essentialism or not, because it's a very natural thing to address the other. I'm not advocating the government guided and the politically initiated conspiracy communitarian world. But like we kind of have to all the time justify like why I referring to the other, and if we at some point like if we get so cautious and so fearful to work with each other, then we cannot do any kind of action to overcoming this such a cautiousness and a fearness, it is very useful to come back to how naturally the relationship between the one and the other is connected with each other. And like now I became very pragmatical, but that could be quite useful, I guess. Even though,
and also if people who are participating in an art project, if they have like a certain guideline or if the possibilities to act are very limited, or if they are invited to participate and can do whatever they want, as in the Cyber Mala project, for example, or if it's just like this tiny little slot of possibilities they find. So just to fill in the concept of an artist, a prefabricated concept.
If I was before sort of criticizing some of the nature of this project-based work from a political angle, I'll come around and criticize it from an artistic angle, which is it was very interesting that Kippenberger would appear in the same context, and of course also Haegue, to talk about how much of this conversation has to do with community and participatory works in an exhibition that you made with, as far as I can tell, no community-based or participatory interactive works is certainly interesting. It is, but then of course then the poetic notion of community is articulated in artworks that become kind of metaphoric. Whereas with a group like Oda Proyesi, I wonder how de-defined our understanding of art must be. I mean, to me, it's problematic that they are called artists. To me, and I wonder how to. I mean, I am an artist, so my own sense of art is kind of solipsistic. But I'm curious to people who are art critics. How do you understand that we could juxtapose Kippenberger and Oda Proyesi's within the same conversation about art, which is interesting. I don't think it happens so often because the art fair world goes over here and the theoretical world goes over here, and they don't actually meet so often that a painter and Oda Proyesi would meet in the same conversation. So I'm curious, how do you see our understanding of art in relationship, also just to medium?
I mean, I feel like you're close to, when you're talking like this about Oda Proyesi, that it's difficult for you to think that they are artists, that you are close to the term, correct me if I'm wrong, or is it social work? And I think that was some discussion that was really very important concerning these art projects I mentioned first in the beginning of the 90s, this community-based projects, that there was this question discussed, is it social work, the artist as a social worker? Of course, every artist said, of course not, I'm not a social worker, and indeed, artists are working differently, of course, than social workers. They have a different mission, different, I don't know, ideas, or are not so target-oriented working. And let me mention one example from the United States that was discussed by Mimon Kwon, an art historian who has been writing extensively about site-specific art and community-based art. And she mentioned that it was actually, it had a very negative feedback in the US that artists were getting more and more into this community-based work with a political intention, with the intention to help, with the intention of healing that was mentioned in one text I quoted. And the effect was that many private foundations, and the arts in the US is heavily dependent on private money and foundations, who in the beginning sponsored public art, were giving their money more and more to this art with an effect, because this is art plus an effect. And it's the development was really going into that direction, that very important foundations like the McLennan Foundation in LA, for example, they decided to give their money in the end directly to social work. So money that was previously dedicated to art and public spaces was then rededicated to social work, and this was of course not.
But it's quite funny because the funders, like from my point of view, the funders misunderstood the social aspects of the art piece which is not effective as much as the social work.
It was
itself.
misunderstandable in some of these arts.
Yes, because like this community-based work as an art piece is not based on the effect and effectiveness as much as the real social work.
But there are multiple categories. I mean, there are categories of artists whose fundamental practice is based on responding to grant opportunities. That grant opportunities have within them certain preconditions of certain, at least in the United States, underprivileged groups, and it becomes to me a form of design. Actually, the way to think, the way that they think is more of a designer kind of mentality. But that didn't really answer the question about it being about how it is art. How is autopoiesis art?
I think it depends on the line of tradition you put this art practice in. Of course, you can go back to situationist art, working with but that was a little more.
Well, but it was also because Guy Debord clearly renounced art, and he thought that all of this activity happened when we would leave these institutions, because the possibility of an actual meaningful intervention into everyday life could only happen outside of the frame. What's so interesting about these strategies is, as opposed to happenings or situationism, which were both about taking the poetic moment out of the frame, they're much closer to kind of an ethnographic practice where the normal world reappears in the frame.
I think it has to do a lot with.
No, sorry, I was also thinking on a certain amount of toxicism there. Yeah? I remember there was this really sort of original episode in Buenos Aires where the factory closed down. And so the workers were trying to keep it up with a community run factory. And then a group of artists decided to join their protest. And at the end, they organized a festival, and at the end there was one of these women who happened to be from an indigenous community from the north, near the border from Bolivia, who had come down to Buenos Aires to work in this factory. And she was saying, well, we ended up having fun, but at the beginning I thought, why are the people from the culture here? What do they want from us? And somehow it seemed like the artists needed them more than what they needed the artists.
Then you mean calls that ideological patronage. When artists jump in and say, in effect, let me speak for you.
Yeah.
Let me express your pain or your marginalization or your exploitation or whatever. And that's, I think, one of the great risks of some of the projects we've been talking about. Certainly the projects that Mi-Wan Kwon talks about, in which funding organizations say, we want to give money to a museum as long as the museum brings on someone who is in a position to talk for an underprivileged community or a perceived underprivileged community. She tells this amazing story about Renee Green, who's commissioned by a museum to come and do a project with the black community in an American town, I can't remember where. And so the artist is being asked to sort of turn the liberal guilt that is felt by an institution towards a marginalized community into an aesthetic experience for the gallery goer.
But this the artist marginalized as well. So if like a black artist is invited for a show, it's taken for granted that he or she has to work about ethnic identity.
Yeah. In this instance, Renee Green didn't want to work on that at all. And actually, I think here there's a work of yours. I mean, tell me if I've misunderstood, but in Storage Piece, in this text that accompanied Storage Piece, you mentioned a show in Amsterdam about Korean culture, and because you were at that point living in Europe, but you were asked by the gallery in Amsterdam to provide a work for a show about Korea in some sense. you had to hire a personal shopper in Korea to collect Korean artifacts that would allow you to sort of perform your Koreanness as the museum wanted you to. Is that right?
It is kind of appropriation of what is desired in the enterprise of the show business somehow, which was that time strongly connected with the national representativeness. I'm just afraid that our discussion is more about the identity than community.
It's strongly connected.
Yeah,
As well as with the notion.
But why is it that it should be about community?
No, because we announce it.
No, I know about why.
But if you don't mind, the question.
I know it's thinking matters, but I was wondering why again.
Why I'm interested in the
Yeah.
community, because that suggests the certain the involvement of the oneself in the broader like multiple relations, but as a kind of like political form, but not necessarily like political engagement in the realistic way, but like more abstracted. I don't know how I should describe it. So that was my vision about the community where people could engage more in the broader frame than just single being.
But is this because you refer to these as like these general characters, like the singular being and the community? Were you thinking about it like because who do you make works for, or who do you think about when you make works? Like what is that sort of notion of community? Is such a word.
Such a word.
Yeah, it's a word. You know, what happens if you get rid of that word community? Are you looking for your own engagement to a collective reality, if you want?
Probably. I'm pretty much work on my own definition, which came out that it's not that original my idea. It was already investigated as a quite core idea of the community. So I think like what I found out was it's not my illusion somehow, you know. And there was a kind of delightment or joy of my research in which I have done in Utrecht. And there was like kind of, the source of the strengths I could rely much more than before. Because as an artist, you might know that we work more with our intuitive assumption about things. And I mean, at least in my case was that the instinctive assumption was already there, and you kind of work with this instinct to produce the work, but things are not so clear to myself. And like I was often like reviewing my own work, and which requires some post researches to rationalize it for myself. And that took place while I was in Utrecht, I guess.
But I like to think that writers do the same thing because there's a certain sense of not urgency but contingent relation to not necessarily to their lives and their singularities, but to being able to live a life. You know, that there's a certain attachment to that. So I was sort of I guess that's when the nomadic question comes in. Like, why is this longing? Because I was thinking of your idea. I have to confess that I didn't really understand the idea of the negative as what bundles the community. But I was thinking if that was related to utopia or to the constant desire for that community.
Utopia?
Well, not to the modernist utopia, but to the idea of a constant desire for a community that because it cannot realize it exists.
No, it's just No, completely different, because what Nancy or Blanc show is suggesting is not something is not there, because aspiration we can have. If something is not there, then we have an aspiration for. But this notion of community is already there. It's a core idea. So they don't really present the utopian idea of community.
But the notion is there, but not the community.
No, it is.
Okay.
It is because maybe I will bring another example of how negativity works. Like that, there is a term introduced by the Agamben is the whatever being, or unbaptized children, which means like there is a whatever being refers to something not specific. But at the same, it could be everything, but at the same time, it cannot be anything specific. So it contains the affirmation and negation at the same time. So is it a possibility or impossibility? So that's the whatever being is a different form of mastery of going kind of beyond the distinction between possible and not possible. And that's the negative space they are referring to. It's not the based on the distinction of negative and positive. And that's like dividable. You cannot divide it. It's already there. That's the negative space.
And in Agamben, I mean, I don't know, maybe I'm going to be too nuts and bolts about it. So Agamben suggests, due to a globalized economy, globalized communications technology, the dissolution of the nation state is defining people's primary experience of reality, that then we have an experience of kind of being either global bourgeois or also a kind of undifferentiated being, and that somehow within the undifferentiated being, the whatever being, we could then find something from that would affirm all of us, that we would, and the fantasy is somehow we will then rediscover the movement towards communism, I think. Isn't that Agamben? That's Negri. We'll find it. Okay, so that's Negri, not Agamben. But Blanchot, I mean, I think with Blanchot is also when you talk about Blanchot and Heidegger, it's in the context of also of having a very international discussion, but in Holland, I think it's important to recall the importance of Blanchot and Heidegger being a German, former occasional Nazi sympathizer, with Blanchot, a former French resistance fighter, and also with a figure like René Char, finding solidarity in this kind of very obscure existential debate about language and trying to reach into some kind of pre-Socratic language. But that, I think one thing that I try to use to inform my own understanding of those debates and those questions is that it's within the context of the Second World War and the lived experience of totalitarianism, both as an occupying force and as a governmental force in Germany.
Nothing to add on.
But because otherwise, to me, anyways, they start to slip out. The community things start to slip too much into, or not the community, but the being, pure being, the negative affirmation that is, that is contained by all of us. I don't really. It starts to seem too abstracted to me.
How do you think, sorry, maybe if you give me a second chance to ask the same question. I mean, it's sort of related to what you're saying is, so this exhibition and what you're talking about in terms of community, and the way that you're only talking about the Western philosopher from a certain period, focusing on the idea of community and negativity. Are you interested in getting into the discourse this philosopher discourse, or are you using the form that you're using, which is the artistic language? Do you think of some other possibility to include that into a textual form so that you can get into this kind of discourse, or are you appropriating these ideas to make another story that is yours? That's sort of like my question. How do you formally relate your work as a form into these content of the philosophers that you're talking about right now? Why those
review the process, process and procedure of the development of my production, partly in advance. That, of course, the very intuitive assumption is much more prior than your own reviewing and reflections, and I think that's quite much a general way of how one involved one's own production, and I'm not an exception to it. And I don't think that there is a lack of reflection by myself on not to create the illustrative work, and illustrative, of course, in many different ways. And but I certainly insist suggesting power in the work. I count the suggesting part of the work as a big strength, but we can discuss further what is the suggesting strength in the work. There are many different kinds of forms, and I don't deny the significance of suggesting power in the work.
Suggesting power?
Yeah.
What
the suggestive.
What is like in that is that you mean more that it suggests thoughts, or
I mean lyrical or tangential.
Like, let's say it's not a simple expression of what I'm thinking. Like, there is a distinction between expression and suggestion. And if you do something which is just nothing but a kind of representation of what you think, is just more expressive, then if you are suggesting something is like more than what has happened in your mind or in your head. Like, it's not like therapeutic drawing of mine that I dreamed yesterday.
Your
Because
question was
pretty
much
much
more about how why do you appropriate such specific language and why do you not want to talk about your exhibition? Why do you want to talk about philosophy? And do you see your work?
Was it?
Well, they're sort of all related. No, I'm just very interested about this kind of like very separation of the thing that you're talking about, you know, and then the way that your insistence on separating it, you know, and then also the way that you talk about the content is very much on this. You're hiding the I, you know, and you talk about the subject itself is community, and you keep talking about community, but I don't know how to enter into this discussion
because we have experienced so many times that we had the discussion about the work, like the having an opportunity like today is like for me the opening up the discussion around the work, not about the work, and it's not like avoiding of revealing my own work. I think that we could create a discussion about the work as well. But you know, it's not like one or the other. It's like just was my decision. If I have the one evening, then I would open up discussion around the work, which could be embrace like more diversities of notion of community than my own, because I of course like express my own as well, but not only my own, because then it's like just the work and the discussion about the work.
No, I was just wondering, maybe it answers, but it's just my thought, that if there is a relation between the way you describe community in this like smaller scale, kind of in our relationship with the other, like in a very sort of small scale, and the way in your videos the texts are like such a private instances in relation with the image. And I just was wondering if there is a relation over there or a way to possibly link the text to the work itself.
Yes, even though it's a long journey between these two, but there is, like, for myself, like the way of explanation and how I get there, to include that kind of vulnerable confessional voice to the video work. I think the rebuilding the very core of it's one strategy of mine, that rebuilding one's own singular being is taking a place of the vulnerability, that I can let myself expose, at the same time inviting people. And that's the state of mind that I can be still on my own much, but at the same time sympathizing with others. And that's the state of vulnerability, which was unfolded in the video as a narration of self-reflecting, confessional, as well as introspective voice. And I think there will be another state, but as a whole, this vulnerable state embraced the kind of idea of like a weak thought, like it's very clearly like the thought meaning the kind of rational procedure of one's mind, but at the same time it's a weak, like it's not solid enough. And I think that was the strategy of mine in this exhibition, was to revealing the weak thought and the vulnerable state, to embracing, inviting the other, even though I'm quite much expressive. The funny thing between the videos and the installation is that I kind of like the similar mood or atmosphere of the video trilogy as well as the installation, even though videos are fully charged by like ongoing narratives and lots of like very much like talking, this huge murkiness of never-ending talking, while the installation was quite much silent and almost absent of voice, and but they kind of share the same the unevenness, like unjust way of thinking. Like they are both like kind of squandering certain qualities which we all the time train to use in a very rational way.
It seems to me that in the videos, there's when you get a lot. I mean, you say that there's all this talk, these narratives, but I constantly felt that when I was listening to what I was seeing, what I was listening to really was the spectres of conversations. Were sort of conversations that had had their substance sort of drained out of them in a way. They were ghostly. You know, you talk about the mother and child on the train, and you want to tell them that they're going to the wrong platform, but in the end you don't. And then you talk. There's this policeman who's beating up
a beggar is beat up by
a beggar, exactly. And again, you want to get involved, but you don't. So, and then those are both in restrained courage. And then in Unfolding Places, there's the drunken man who's sort of talking on his own, and the black woman who's talking on her phone. And again, there's a sense that the only person who has a sort of overview of all that's going on and who can connect these different speech acts, whatever, is you, but you're not a participant. So do you see what I mean? That for me connects the videos very, very well, very powerfully to the installation. The way that these moments of contact are missed, The contact isn't made. Conversation is always sort of downgraded to a monologue. And that, to me, says a lot about both identity and community.
I much like the interpretation.
I have a question that came up during the thing, which is not for you, but I think it's related also to Sung's point. And it's a quote by Klaas Oldenburg who said that anyone who listens to an artist speak should have their eyes checked. Or Matisse used to tell his students that they might as well cut out their tongues. Right? Okay, so obviously this was.
Can you repeat what you just said?
There were two quotes. One is Klaas Oldenburg said, "Anyone who listens to an artist talk should have their eyes checked." You shouldn't listen to artists talk because their point isn't to be talking, right? They should be making stuff that is articulated. The other one was Matisse said. He said to his students, "You might as well cut out your tongues because the point is for you to be able to do this with the painting." Obviously, something has shifted. I mean, to the point that in the framework of an art exhibition, there's an artist mediating, and one artist has suggested that we have basically an academic presentation of papers is kind of the framework that we started with. So I'm curious. I don't understand this very well at all, but I wonder what the art critics make of this transformation in art. I mean, obviously something really changed in 40 years. Klaas Oldenburg's my father's age almost. So something has changed in one generation about a very fundamental understanding of process and product, of vision and language, of literature and pictures.
That actually reminds me of a question I wanted to ask Nina, which is how do you write about it? Haegue was saying earlier that she's slightly troubled by the very emphatic authorial presence in work by Hirschhorn or Sierra. Now, that criticism could not be levelled at the kind of work that you were talking about earlier. But then, how do you as a critic write? And I'm not so troubled about distinctions between art and social work. It doesn't worry me so much. But as soon as a certain kind of work enters the art world, then it's your job and my job to write about it. And I think that there's a kind of crisis, a critical crisis in the encounter with relational work, with participative or interactive work, with the kind of work you were describing. I don't think critics know. I think critics do one of two things. They, and actually Claire Bishop, who was mentioned in both of your presentations, gets a lot of mileage out of making fun of the critical responses to this kind of work. It seems that critics either just describe relational work or participative, or they say, well, I went to Tiravania's show and he cooked some curry and I sat down and I had the curry and I chatted to my friend. So the other critical mode seems to be a sort of first-person narrative, a sort of almost diaristic narrative. So what do you think? Would you think that what kind of critical avenues are opened up or closed by the kind of work that you were describing?
First, I fully agree that in several respects there is kind of a crisis in criticism at the moment. And I would also say that it's really very strange that this discussion on Bourdieu, for example, is starting now, because his work, it was published in '98, Esthétique Relationnelle, and it was just translated
later.
And, I think even the Esthétique Relationnelle is published first in English and later published in French.
I don't think it's just like now.
I think
Yeah, it's not really.
Some essays that
published over in
Documentation now.
They were
Then they're
written
buying
over
it.
and over.
But anyhow, the point is clear that it's discussed now, much more heavier than when it freshly published.
But that means it was translated into English very late, so then the English-speaking community picked up on all those kind of ideas that he was writing about a long time before, actually.
I think people have been talking about Bourdieu for at least 3 or 4, certainly in England, for a few years.
But let's not bore you, but
but to get back to what you said, I think that criticism of discussing participatory work has to be informed by several different theoretical backgrounds. So it's not enough if you have like an art historical background like that, because if art starts leaving the boundaries of the art field, then of course criticism has to come after. And this is also what, coming back to this Oda Bourgeoisie discussion and the definition, is it art or not, I think there's also clearly this interest which has a lot to do with institutions, with framework, infrastructure, to break out of this and to bring art and life together, but to also to escape all these regulatory frameworks set up by art institutions. And
but regulatory frameworks, I mean, if you're thinking of critical frameworks, of course, they're problematic, but without them we can't really write. And we need terminologies, we need, however limiting and however, they miss the work very often. We need them. And so do you see these kind of frameworks evolving? And which kind of theoretical models or texts might we be drawing on to develop a way of writing that doesn't focus on the author, that doesn't focus on, the people behind Oda Bourgeoisie, but the people who are actually involved in that project and went there to...
I think that field was opened up by cultural studies.
Yeah.
So...
What I wonder is when you say it's going to reach out, because to me it seems very transparent what emerges, and I'm not letting either of you off of the hook about Matisse's tongue. I want to know what happened to art. I'm very. How is this? Why is art so discursive? Maybe this explains it. This is why art is so discursive, in that artists then, to articulate ourselves, we become discursive too somehow. Or discursive people like me, I was discursive before I was an artist, got interested in art because it was this place where discourse seemed more palpable than if I had stayed in the strict academy or in social sciences. But the theoretical framework that emerges into the art world is incredibly limited. It is incredibly limited to a kind of a basic de facto Marxism, let's defend the social welfare state, it's the only way to go. I mean, when you were referring to the end of the social system in Eastern Europe, it's odd that you did not mention the end of secret police structures in Eastern Europe, for instance. To my kind of political analysis, I mean, the possibility for free, open debate is also goes hand in hand with those things in Poland, for instance. But I never hear anyone in the art world talk about Václav Havel, for instance. I never hear anyone in the art world talk about any Eastern European political experience, because all the people I meet in the Western European art world are basically Marxists, and so the idea, they still have this weird fantasy for Eastern Europe. To me, that's what I see.
Do you think that the discursive context where most of contemporary practice are located in is completely based on knowledge and fact structures? That we have to embrace the old, as much as the journalists provide?
No, that would be nicer. I think instead we have kind of a watered-down social sciences.
What do you mean nicer?
No, I also think that there's a misunderstanding of there's a mixture of disciplines. The fact that we like to read philosophy doesn't mean that there cannot be an art discourse that is articulated around practice. Nothing to do with what critics write about or what philosophers think about, excepting for the fact that there's a common epistemologic field, which is contemporary life, basically.
Like Haegue is very much entering into a kind of discourse about, existing relations and trying to enter into those kind of social structures.
But maybe isn't that just a new bureaucratic structure of the welfare state, where it mirrors itself?
Actually, there's an even more pessimistic argument, which is that as artists step in to provide, certain services, that becomes a pretext for social services to
But I wouldn't call it service. I mean, it's not social services. I think that they're trying to enter into a discussion in order to alter these kind of situations and get people to be more active within their own situations to be critical. And I think that when you talk about how there's an absence of discussion around these areas, you've just been sitting for 3 hours talking about community and these kind of practices, and a lot of questions have come up. And that's the kind of thing that people are writing about.
But kind of still legitimate to raise up those kind of the question, because through this skepticism towards the practices, we kind of understand how asymmetrical our effort is compared to the result what we get, and that's the kind of idea of productivity that we include in the art production as well as art criticism, but on productiveness not necessarily being we have to all the time unproductive, but we can be overproductive as well. It's very asymmetrical things that how intensive in the quality and the quantity effects and so on, and that unjust and unevenness is already there and still to observe in many communal practices. That's why that's the kind of the point the communal project could be distinguished from the social discipline of the social researchers, or not convincing.
I don't think I understood.
But I think many questions arise, but there is still what kind of community we dream of, or what kind of community we're talking about is not really reserved in today's discussion. It's not really clarified, but I'd like to suggest to take this question to the back, to the building, with some drinks and keeping the tensions, agonistic tensions, and then proceed the discussion. So thank you for being together being just together, not with me. And I'd like to announce next program at BAC, just 13th of June, it's in 3 weeks. So another discussion take place by occasion of book launch of a report, not announcement. It also kind of related to what we discussed, because the project premise on the condition of mobility, everyone is moving around, a lot of people displaced, and what could get from this condition of mobility. So we invite you to proceed and to specify and articulate our questions further. Thank you.